Okay, good morning. So we are doing Muhammad and the rise of Islam today. Muhammad, as you know, is one of the most important and influential figures in human history. He is as important as Jesus. But ironically, we actually don't know that much about Muhammad. In fact, we probably know more about Jesus than we know about Muhammad. With Jesus, at least we have a lot of his quotations, a lot of his sayings, which give us insight into his philosophy, his religion, his thinking. But with Muhammad, we don't have that many quotations. We don't have that many written sources. In fact, the Quran, which is the holy book of the Islamic tradition, doesn't really mention him, even though, in theory, it is written by him. In fact, one of the earliest written documents about Muhammad is actually from a Christian bishop, written about 20, 30 years after Muhammad's death in 632 CE. Okay? So we know he exists. So we know that he was a real person, and he was the founder of the Islamic tradition. And this is what Sibyl says about Muhammad. At that time, a certain man from along those same sons of Ishmael, whose name was Mamet. Okay, so Mamet is Muhammad. In fact, we don't even know what his real name is. Muhammad just means blessed one in Arabic. A merchant, okay, so he was a merchant, as if by God's command appeared to them as a preacher. So he was a prophet who rallied the Arabs to his cause. Abandoning their vain cults, they turned to the living God who had appeared to the father Abraham. Okay, so Muhammad converted the polytheistic Arabs to the monotheism of the Jews. So Muhammad legislated for them not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsely, and not to engage in fornication. He said, with an oath, God promised this land to Abraham and his seed after him forever. And he brought about as he promised during that time while he loved Ishmael. Okay, so what he's saying is the Arabs are the descendants of Abraham, just like the Jews and the Christians. But now you are the sons of Abraham, and God is accomplishing his promise to Abraham and his seed to you. Okay, God promised you the promised land. And now this land has been taken away from you. Okay, Jerusalem, Israel has been taken away from you. And now we will take it back by going to war. Jihad, holy war. Love sincerely only the God of Abraham, and go and seize the land which God gave to your father Abraham. No one will be able to resist you in battle because God is with you. Okay? So this is actually very similar to the story of Moses in the Bible, right? The Jews were enslaved in Egypt, and Moses appeared before them and promised to take them back to Israel. Right, so this is clearly following an ancient tradition. And so Muhammad, in many ways, is like Moses. In fact, what's really strange is that in the Quran, the most quoted figure, the figure that is most mentioned, is Moses, not Muhammad or Jesus. Okay? So let's try to figure out what's going on here. First of all, what Muhammad is saying is that Christians, Jews, and Arabs are all one big family. Why? Because in the Bible, it says that Abraham made a covenant with Yahweh. Abraham swore allegiance to Yahweh. In return, Yahweh gave him the promised land. Now, the promised land is not Israel. The promised land is all that territory going from the Nile to the Tigris in modern-day Iraq. So it's basically the entire Middle East. Okay, that's what the promised land is. Now, this is important because Abraham had a wife, Sarah. Sarah, for most of her life, was not able to give birth. And if you don't have descendants, if you don't have children, they don't get the promised land, right? So in desperation, Sarah gave Abraham her maid named Hagar. And Abraham impregnated Hagar, and Hagar gave birth to a son named Ishmael. And then Ishmael went to the Arabian desert, and he is the father of the Arab people. Okay, and that's where Muhammad comes from, the Arabs. Sarah, by the miracle of God, would eventually be able to give birth to the Israelites. Okay? And as we know, the Israelites will eventually become the Christians. So in other words, the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims, they have a common ancestor in Abraham. Okay? So this is what this is saying. So even though we don't have that many written sources about Muhammad, we have something called the Hadith. Okay? The Hadith. The Hadith is Arabic, and it just means an oral tradition. So there are these stories about Muhammad that has been passed on orally from generation to generation, celebrating his life. And so let's go over what is traditionally understood about Muhammad. So Muhammad was born in the year 570 into an Arab tribe. Okay, and he's born in a place called Mecca in the Arabian desert. He became a trader, a merchant, because most people at that time were either nomads or merchants. And at a very young age, he married a very wealthy widow. And until the age of 40, his life was prosperous but uneventful. Then at age 40, he started to meditate in a cave. Okay, that's a very common thing, to go to a cave and to meditate as a form of religious worship. And while he was at the cave, the angel Gabriel appeared before Muhammad. And he said to Muhammad, "You and your family have lost the way. You are the descendants of Ishmael, who brought the religion of Yahweh to the desert. Back then you were monotheistic, but then over time you became corrupted and became polytheistic. And so you have a mission to tell your fellow Arabs the story of Yahweh, the story of the Bible, and to return them to the love of Yahweh, return them to monotheism." And so Gabriel, in a series of visions, would tell Muhammad the story of the Bible, okay? Including Moses, his taking the people, the chosen people, the Jews, from Egypt back to the Promised Land. And this is considered a miracle and true because Muhammad was an illiterate merchant who had no exposure to the Bible. So this had to be true. And this shows that this is all a miracle. So Muhammad is now inspired by the archangel Gabriel to preach the word of God. But at this time, Arabia is a polytheistic, primitive, and backward society. So the people of Mecca reject him. He spends 13 years in Mecca preaching the word, but they reject him. So eventually he decides to move to Medina. Okay? And this move is very important. It's called the Hijrah. Okay? The immigration. He and his followers move from Mecca to Medina, and this starts the Islamic tradition. And this marks the year 0 in the Islamic calendar. just as the birth of Jesus marks the year 0 in the Christian calendar. Okay? So he goes to Medina because the tribes there have invited him to be a judge. The tribes there, one of the tribes is actually Jewish. They're fighting amongst themselves. And they need someone to arbitrate their disputes. And so Muhammad goes and he creates something called the Constitution of Medina, which promises the freedom of religious expression to all people. Okay? There will be no religious prejudice in Medina. Eventually, over time, more and more followers are attracted to his message of monotheism, and he starts to build a following, an army. But because he's preaching a faith that is counter the mainstream faith, he gets attacked by other Arab tribes. And there's some setbacks, but through the love of God, through the will of God, he triumphs over them, and he unites the Arabian Peninsula. Now, at this point, they are a threat to the two major world empires at this time. The Byzantine Empire, who adheres to the Roman Empire, as well as the Sasanian Persian Empire. And they both attack him. They both attack the Muslims. But again, through the miracle of God, the Muslims are able to defeat both empires. And in less than 100 years, they conquer most of the world. Okay?